Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session on meeting global privacy challenges with ISO 27701. We have speaker Mr. Dheeraj Saxena with us, and we will be starting our webinar at 3 p.m. There are still 2 minutes left. I will be grateful if you would like to be patient and just for 2 minutes, and we will be starting on time. Thank you for your cooperation and understanding.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dheeraj, and I'm joined by Prashant, my colleague, and we welcome you to this webinar. Just 2 minutes before we start. Thank you for your patience, please. Prashant, I hope my audio is absolutely fine. You can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you very well, Mr. Saxena.
Thanks, Prashant. Thanks so much, everyone. We welcome you to this webinar on meeting global privacy challenges with ISO 27701. Our objective is to give you a high-level overview of the best practices of this management standard on privacy, and this will hopefully help you meet the requirements of your key stakeholders with respect to privacy. I just want to also add here that this standard is neutral to any geography or any law, and it can form a very good baseline for any organization who wants to meet the obligations related to privacy and wherever they are. And this standard is can be readily customized by your organization when you start implementing that. The objective of this webinar is to equip you if you want to brief your management on the salient aspects of such a management system, and maybe it can help you in identifying the next steps towards implementing a privacy program as well. So let's get started. Your views and comments are welcome. Do use the questions or the chat screen for uh, making it as interactive as possible. This session is being recorded. We will go through some polling as well, and we assure you that whatever views you express via the polls or the chat will be kept anonymous. So thanks so much once again for joining. Let's get started. My name is Dheeraj, and I'm joined by my colleague Prashant. A quick overview about me. Uh, I manage the training portfolio for BSI India, and I'm a very passionate trainer on the following aspects. So I have trained on information security management, privacy, service management, which is ISO 20000, risk management according to ISO 31000, anti-bribery management, and then finally innovation management also. The agenda in the next 40 minutes, we'll go through the basic aspects of privacy so that we are all on the same page in terms of what is privacy and why it matters to us, whether as individuals or as organizations. We'll also look at a deep dive into ISO 27701, the approach per se, the high level approach towards managing a privacy program. And then finally, we'll go deeper into 27701, look at some of the clauses and the controls of this standard as well in the next 40 minutes. And then maybe we'll leave another 20 minutes for your Q&A so that we are ending at 4 p.m. sharp. Let's go back one step and look at what is privacy and why it matters. And I'll just spend 2 minutes on this slide so that we are all on the same page. So there are three aspects to privacy. The first one being solitude. That means my will as an individual to be left alone, not to be disturbed or to be observed or to be intruded upon. I don't want anyone to observe me, in the privacy of my home or in the privacy of my office. I need my personal space. So I need solitude. The second aspect is anonymity. So, for example, you don't want your identity to be disclosed when you are casting a vote. If you go to an election, you may have expressed your views publicly, but you don't want anyone to be able to associate your identity with your vote. So that's anonymity. Another aspect related to privacy is the secrecy or the confidentiality aspect, in which I, as an individual, have the right to decide who all will have access to my personal information and for what purpose, and I want the access to be restricted. So for example, you are being onboarded as an employee in a new organization, and they ask you for your medical records, your curriculum vitae, your personal details, your family details, and some of these aspects are very, very sensitive personal data, and you want this personal data to be kept very, very securely and confidentially, and only a very restricted access to that. So that's the third aspect called secrecy. The whole idea behind privacy as a fundamental right of individuals is that you own your presence. It's your presence, it's your life. You need to decide when you want to be observed or not, and if you don't want to be, that's fine. Then another aspect why privacy matters is that if there's a breach of any information or your presence against your wishes, then it may cause material impact to you, maybe physical impact, maybe emotional impact to your well-being. So that's why privacy matters to us as an individual. Let's consider a typical scenario as an example. So your bank issues a credit or debit card to you, and they collected your personal information, and they also decide that maybe this card will be co-branded by an airline, and that airline will offer you some kind of a loyalty program if you use that airline, and they will give you some free miles. But the point here is, what are the risks involved? Has the bank ensured your consent being taken before this data was shared with the airline? And then what data, what personal information has been shared with the airline? Does the airline have all the controls necessary to protect your personal information? We don't know. And then this may get complicated further in the sense that this airline may contract another marketing agency to market your data and continue the loyalty program on an ongoing basis. They will continue maybe selling or upselling you other products as well. So you never know where all this data has gone to which third party, whether that third party is as responsible as you expect them to be. And then this particular marketing agency may have put your personal information on a cloud service provider, and we don't know what controls, what access levels are there in the cloud service, and whether your data remains within this country or maybe it's there on the cloud anywhere. So some of the risks which you may want to look at is, let's have a look at the risks. So maybe you can use the chat box or the question box uh, to let me know before I tell you what are the typical risks to your personal information if you consider this typical scenario, which is a day-to-day aspect. So would you like to type your responses in the chat box, please? And then I'll definitely give you some of the risks. Waiting for the responses. Are we getting some?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. And I thank the audience for being participative. Please, let's make it interactive to the extent possible. Thanks so much for your responses. So some of the aspects related to risks to your personal information can be processing of your personal data without your knowledge or explicit consent. Or even if they've taken your explicit consent, how much have they collected? Have they collected more than what is needed? Hmm? Have they minimized the data or not? So they may have collected data about your work history, credit score, etc., which may not have been needed at all. And then, do they acknowledge your rights as a data subject? You have a fundamental right to privacy. If you're in a country which is in Europe or US, you have specific rights in which you can actually ask the data controller what data they are holding, for what purpose, what are the safeguards, and so on and so forth. And maybe you have the right to get your data corrected as well if it's inaccurate, or if you think that they are not using it for the purpose which they had promised, then you can ask them to restrict the processing of data. So do these entities acknowledge your rights or not? If not, then it's a risk to you. Then, as we saw in the scenario, your data could have been shared with third parties such as the marketing agency and the cloud service provider. Have you been informed about that? Is your consent being taken for that? What are the safeguards involved? And then, even if all this is absolutely fine, how long are they retaining your data? Are they retaining it even after the loyalty program has finished? Do they still need it? What are they doing with it? How will they dispose it of securely? You never know. And then if in the midst of all this, there is some kind of a threat which materializes in the data controller or the data processor, then what can be the material impact to you? These are some typical risks which you and me should always be considering wherever our data goes, because remember, you own your presence. Let's look at it from an organizational perspective. So far, we've looked at it from a personal perspective. Let's look at it from an organizational perspective. So what are the social legal drivers and challenges for organizations? Maybe your organization, if it's collecting personal information, and assume that it's having clients which have those expectations with respect to privacy. So we have one of the drivers is the heightened public awareness worldwide. We've seen that maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, the culture with respect to privacy was initiated with some of the laws in UK. So, for example, you had the UK Data Protection Act way back in 1998, which was 2 decades before the GDPR arrived, and so on and so forth. You had so many laws being enacted in various countries in Europe, Asia Pacific, the US, etc., to acknowledge the fundamental right to privacy and to exercise restraint and responsibility in dealing with personal information. If you talk to someone in other countries, they are very particular about sharing their personal information, and they'll ask you, why do you need this? In addition to that, this kind of a personal awareness, public awareness, has triggered a lot of laws and regulations around the world, which you and me know, whether it's the EU GDPR or the California Privacy Act or the Singapore Privacy Act or the Australian or Chinese Privacy Acts. So, and the whole aspect here is that these laws are now extraterritorial. That means if you are serving a client based out of Europe, then via the contracts or the SLAs that you have, they will ensure that penalties are applicable to you in the event of a breach of privacy. So that's another aspect which organizations need to look at. But then, is it only because of penalties? Don't we want to uphold our brand image? I mean, irrespective of penalties, don't we want to instill customer confidence by abiding with these data protection principles? And then all these laws have enunciated a lot of rights of data subjects in which they can challenge the organization basis those rights. And I'm sure we are aware of most of these. So, for example, the right to transparency, the right of a data subject to know what personal information is being stored by the controller, or the right to get the data rectified if it's inaccurate, or maybe the right to restrict processing of personal information if it's being used for malified purposes, or maybe the right to escalate to a supervisory authority. So all these three aspects, I think, have triggered organizations to embark on privacy programs for their clients in order to uphold the expectations of their stakeholders. So with this as a context, let's move on and get your perspective. So here's a question, and I'm going to request my colleague Prashant to initiate a poll here, a very quick 1-minute poll. Do you think that regulations like EU GDPR have they changed the way in which Indian organizations collect and process personal data? So imagine your organization catering to European clients. Uh, has that triggered some kind of a change in the way you collect and process personal information of those clients? So you can answer yes or no, and we're waiting for your results. So I hope responses are coming forth, Prashant.
Yes, it is. Right now, only 74% people have responded. So I would request other people also to respond so that it
Okay,
will be helpful for Dheeraj.
yeah, let's wait for another maybe 20 seconds and then close the poll, please. So Prashant, I'll just request you to summarize the views of the people, please. Thank you.
Okay, 82% people are saying yes, and
Okay,
18% people are saying no. We have
okay,
just 86% people who have voted as for now.
okay, great. So let's close the poll, Prashant. Thanks so much, everyone, for your responses. So I think majority of you have experienced the need to maybe revise your processes and procedures pertaining to the way in which you collect personal information. Just a sec. Okay, let's go on to ISO 27701. And I'm going to talk about a very holistic and logical approach to managing a privacy program. So if you suppose are you get a mandate from your top management to maybe establish, maintain, and improve a privacy program, how would you go about doing it? What will be your first step? And maybe how would you approach the entire program? And let's look at it not only from ISO perspective, please. Let's look at it from a very holistic and logical perspective that this is what we need to do, and then see whether ISO can address all those aspects or not. So the first one here, the first block in front of you is determine your organization's context and approach. The word context here implies what is the environment, what are the important factors in which you're operating your privacy program, and what are the factors which you need to address if your privacy program has to be successful. So with that as a base, let's look at what needs to be done. Maybe one of the first things that you will need to do as a leader of your privacy program is to determine your organization's role, whether it's a data controller or a data processor or the third party. Data controller, as you would know, is that entity which decides what to collect and for what purpose, and is primarily accountable to the data subjects. The processor is basically acting on behalf of the data controller in an outsourced kind of an agreement. So what are the roles and responsibilities? What are the obligations to your clients in terms of the SLAs, in terms of the master services agreement and the contracts that you have signed for privacy, particularly? One has to keep them in mind if you were to be successful in your relationship with your stakeholders. Then, in addition to all this, would you not also look at what are the applicable laws and rights of the data subjects? So, for example, if you are catering to a geography like, say, Asia Pacific, and maybe your client is spread across Singapore as well as Europe, you would look at multiple laws being applicable to that particular process which you are running out of India. Maybe they have outsourced that process to you. So as I mentioned, these are extraterritorial laws, and hence they will applicable to you via the contracts that have been signed, legally enforceable contracts. or binding contracts as they are called. Then once having determined the context, then maybe you would like to embark on setting the tone of the privacy program. And I think a very good way of setting the tone is through a privacy related policy by enunciating the privacy related objectives in that policy, what matters to us, So maybe you will then communicate all that policy aspect, and then uh, have some structures in order to support and implement these policies. So when we talk about structures, we talk about organization structures for governance. We talk about structures such as the risk management approach, structures such as the due diligence approach, and so on and so forth. So let's look at some of these. How do we extend our risk management approach to privacy? Your organization already has a risk management approach, but is it tailored or is it fit for purpose when it comes to privacy related risks? May not be. So how to do that? Maybe you will need to modify some risk criteria in the risk management approach. Maybe you will now start to look at the impact to the data subjects, because previously in your ISMS risk assessment process, you were looking at only the impact to your own organization, but now you need to look at impact to data subjects as well. So your risk criteria might change, or additional criteria get added. Then, as a result of additional processes and criteria and controls, what other roles and responsibilities have arisen? Maybe you need to appoint some specific people like the data protection officer or some compliance officers, or you want to maybe institutionalize all this in the current staff itself. But there are some additional roles and responsibilities just because of the privacy related expectations of the stakeholders. What kind of training and awareness is needed to manage this program? So there's no point having roles and responsibilities defined and not making them competent. You need to make the people competent. You need to maybe acquire some resources in terms of technology, etc., for encryption or pseudonymization or anonymization as well. So you need resources, and in order to make those resources competent, you need to give them training on these platforms and the new processes. What should be your communication strategy? It's not only the top management which has to enunciate the policy. That communication needs to flow down to the departmental heads, the team leaders, right down to the level. So for example, if you are a customer service agent, for the sake of discussion, a customer service agent should know his or her roles and responsibilities while collecting data, because they are the ones who are directly interfacing with the client and collecting and exchanging their personal information. So do they know for what reason are they collecting? Have you put some controls to minimize the collection of that data? Are they disclosing data which they should not? So it's a matter of making these people competent enough with the ongoing communication strategy and the training and awareness programs. So that's about risk identification and establishing structures. Once you've done that, then it's a matter of operationalizing those structures. That means putting them into effect on a day-to-day basis. Everyone needs to know what they need to do on a day-to-day basis in order to adhere to the principles of data protection. So for example, you may put some technical controls. You may have some role-based access being given. You may put a selective access on the RDBMS or the database as well. You may want to minimize data collection at the point of collection itself. So you institute some kind of a electronic form, and there are some fields, only those fields can be populated. No other data can be collected itself. So, and when you are storing data or transmitting it, you are encrypting it. These are some very typical technical controls. But then technology by itself will not make the program successful. There are many other types of controls which you need. So for example, you need administrative controls. You talked about the privacy policy. We talked about the risk management approach to privacy. We talked about due diligence also, due diligence for business partners. So if you are exchanging your data with your business partners, what kind of controls do they have to protect that personal information? So you may want to do some kind of a due diligence before onboarding your business partners and want to continue that due diligence on an ongoing basis as well. You may want to train your business partners so that across the supply chain, the controls are uniform and consistent. Then you may want to have some procedural controls like standard operating procedures being modified, the work instructions being modified accordingly. Then you may have the maker checker concept. That means there has to be some kind of a quality check over and above what data is being collected, for what purpose, is it being minimized or not, how is it being stored, how is it being transmitted, what is the data retention policy, how is it being finally disposed of. All those quality checks need to be there in terms of procedural controls. And then last but not the least, some kind of legal controls as well. So you may want to have a specialist team of experts who are validating each and every contract with your customer, and then distilling out the requirements related to data protection, and also informing you as an organization what are the applicable laws and how we want to change our standard operating procedures to comply with those laws. Or irrespective of the laws, what are the specific instructions given by the client? Are those being reflected by our standard operating procedures or not? And then are there quality checks on those SOPs or not? There's a word called DSAR in the last block, data subject access request. Now, as we discussed, the data subject has right to ask the data controller what data is being processed, what data is being collected, for what purpose, what are the safeguards, how long will it be there. So those kind of requests for information are called data subject access requests. They have to be responded by the data controller or the data processor within a specific amount of time, say 1 month or so. And you may have millions of customers if you are a B2C kind of an organization. So you need to have a whole team of people. You need to decide how data subject access requests will be uh, collected by your organization, maybe via the website or via email or multiple channels. Who will be monitoring those channels? Who will be responsible for responding to those DSARs? And before the response goes, who will be responsible for validating and ensuring that the organization's response is as per the applicable laws and expectations or not? So you need legal controls as well. So once you've operationalized these structures and the controls, then it's about time for you and your management to review the entire privacy program, not only the controls, but also whether there's a culture for protecting personal information across the organization or not, or is it there just in the documentation? So you may want to do some independent reviews in the shape of internal audits, in the form of internal audits. And you may want to do some compliance check at the departmental level. So you may have a multi-tiered approach towards reviewing the effectiveness and adapting to the changing context. So you may have a multi-tiered governance structure, maybe starting from the departmental level, in which you are reporting monthly compliance scores for each department, whether it is HR, sales or marketing, customer support. Then you have independent reviews being conducted by a separate independent team of auditors, and they are looking at the entire efficacy of the privacy management program. And last but not the least, you have the top management also reviewing the overall privacy program in terms of various key performance indicators. And then how are the exceptions being tracked? There will always be exceptions. So what? We have to minimize those exceptions. We have to report those exceptions and maybe come out with some remedial actions from those exceptions. Uh, and those measures of effectiveness, such as the KPIs which we talked about, how many number of DSARs received and responded, what is the amount of customer complaints with respect to privacy, are there any incidents, and then if there are, then what is the remedial action for those incidents, what's our customer satisfaction on privacy, etc., and so on and so forth. There'll be so many KPIs coming out, and it's better to have a set of key performance indicators for each department. Maybe you can have KPIs related to awareness. How many people have actually uh, passed the training and awareness program successfully? And then what are the number of exceptions in quality in while processing personal information? So on and so forth. Many KPIs can be there for you. And then over and above all this, the business landscape may itself change because laws continue to be revised, and or maybe customer expectations are changing. So your SLAs and the statement of work may change, and hence you will need to maybe augment your SOPs accordingly, maybe augment your privacy objectives, and make some minor changes in your privacy policy. So the whole thing is dynamic. It's not static at all. So if you look at this slide, it seems to be a heavy one, but this is a very, very logical and structured approach. You start with determining your organization's context. Where do we stand? What matters for us? What are our obligations? And then you identify what can go wrong. What are the privacy risks to us? What structures do we need, whether at governance layer, whether at due diligence layer, or maybe training and awareness programs? What kind of structures do we need? And then how do we operationalize all these structures and the controls? And then last but not the least, are these structures and controls fit for purpose or not? If not, what changes do we make and how do we move on? So that's a very, very logical approach. uh, and ISO 27701, I think, is mapped very closely to this logical approach. But then before we go to that, may I ask you, if you were the leader for a privacy program in your organization, you're given the task, you're given the mandate by your top management, would a systematic approach like the one which we discussed and a tailored approach, it's not only systematic, you have to tailor it, customize it, will it help you to succeed? Yes or no? So Prashant, request you to open that poll, please. Thank you.
Sure, Dheeraj. Just give me a minute. So you guys would be able to see the poll on your screen. We will be opening this poll for the next 10 seconds more. We already have 74% people who have voted for this.
And I really appreciate the agility of the response, Prashant. So thanks once again to the participants. Okay, I
So
think
so
we can
far we have
close it.
received 82% of vote, and 98% of those who have voted are saying yes, and 2% are saying no.
Okay, we
I'm
value both
closing
the
the poll
types of
now.
response. Yeah, thanks so much, Prashant. So thanks so much for your responses. And let's take a deep dive into 27701 now. So if you look at this uh, diagram here, it says extension to 27001 and 27002 for privacy information management requirements and guidelines. So as the name suggests, this standard builds over and above the ISMS standard, and we'll see what are the additions in the next 15 minutes or so. But the point here is it is essentially building and modifying the subclauses of 27001 as well as the controls which you saw in Annexure A of 27001. And there are so many other guidelines in addition to this. So let's have a look at this. So as I mentioned, the clauses of 27001 have been modified and augmented. There are 26 additional subclauses. Then if you look at Annexure A of 27001, which is explained in detail in 27002, 32 of those 114 controls of Annexure A have been modified so that we can help the organization adapt to the privacy program. And last but not the least, there are 49 additional controls in the form of guidelines for controllers and processors. So this particular standard 27701 has got two annexures, Annexure A and B of 27701. Annexure A gives additional guidelines for controllers. Annexure B gives additional guidelines for processors, data controllers and data processors. So just to be clear on the abbreviations which I've used on the slide, PIMS means Privacy Information Management System. Data controller is the entity that determines the purposes and means for processing, and processor is the entity to whom the data controller has outsourced the processing. But all these entities are accountable to the data subjects, which is you and me. Having said this, let's look at the salient requirements which have been added to 27001. So I'm taking a deep dive into 27701, and these are the additions. So we're going to talk about privacy risk assessment considerations. We're going to talk about operational management considerations and the nuances in 27701. We're going to talk about governance of the privacy program. We're going to talk about some features related to additional guidance for data controllers, which were not there in 27001, and then additional guidance for data processors as well. So let's go ahead. The first one being privacy risk assessment considerations. So what is it? What are the aspects that will help you upgrade your existing ISMS into a PIMS, Privacy Information Management Systems? Let's look at those. So how do you extend your risk management process so that the criteria, the risk criteria can include privacy risks as well, maybe in terms of likelihood and impact, and what kind of data inventory would you have? How would you collect the data inventory across the organization? How would you decentralize the whole collection of data inventory and monitoring of data inventory, and then look at risks? What can go wrong in that data inventory? So when I say data inventory, I'm talking about personal information particularly. And how are you identifying personal data, which I talked about, data inventory, and then who are the risk owners? So unless you make specific people in each department accountable for managing the risk will only stay on paper, which we don't want. We want the risk to be managed to a negligible level, brought down from a high or medium to a negligible level. So you assign accountability to the risk owners in each department based on whatever personal information they are processing in their respective department or function or process. Then once you make them accountable, you ask them to present the data inventory and the privacy risk profile to their management, maybe once a quarter or once in 6 months, depending on how fast the risk profile is changing. If it's changing very dynamically, then the frequency of review can be increased to quarterly or monthly. If it's not so dynamic, maybe you can do it once in 6 months, but it has to be done. And the department head or the functional head, I think, is the prime owner for reviewing the top risks to personal data as per the data inventory. Then uh, the departmental head or the functional head is also owning overall what controls to be implemented to address these risks and make them negligible. And obviously, the statement of applicability, which you had gone through in the 27001 as well, which is nothing but a listing of all the controls and justifications which are applicable, which are not applicable. Obviously, you will have to modify your statement of applicability because there are so many additional controls now or modified controls. Some may be applicable to your organization, some may not be. Wherever which is not applicable, you need to justify that as well. So these are some of the aspects which you will need to maybe add into your existing risk management program in order to upgrade it from an ISMS to PIMS. Let's look at how to operationalize the management uh, of structures and risk treatment. So what would be the added roles and responsibilities and associated training needs? All of these aspects which I'm talking about are related to specific clauses of 27701. I haven't mentioned the clause numbers here because I did not want to complicate here, but these are directly coming from clauses of 27701. Then what specific appointments are needed in the organization structure? We talked about DPO being one. Maybe what roles and responsibilities will be assigned to the departmental heads, because now they are owning the privacy risks related to their department as well. So if I'm the departmental head of, say, the customer support department, and I know it's a high risk department because all my frontline staff are actually interacting on a day-to-day basis, collecting personal information from my end customers, exchanging personal information to them where, as and when needed, responding to their DSARs or data subject access requests. So I own, as a departmental head, I own the risk to my department. And then in order to demonstrate this ownership, I need to be apprised about what are the risks, how many complaints are coming, what are the exceptions happening, how many DSARs have not responded on time, uh, and what is my data inventory, what pieces of data are there which we don't have any legal basis for that data. I need to be aware of all this so that I can prevent risks in my department from materializing. Because remember, if the breaches happen, ultimately the board of directors is accountable as per law. So the board of directors is going to ask the departmental head what happened, where did we go wrong, how did the organization come into this position which has impacted its brand. So the ownership has to be with the departmental head. Then how do we build a culture for PIMS? By integrating it with the standard operating procedures. What SOPs, existing SOPs, no need to have different set of SOPs, just modify the SOPs in such a way that whenever you're collecting personal information, you're first of all challenging and finding out, is there a lawful basis, is there a legal basis, do we have a consent from the data subject for giving or collecting this information? If there's a consent, do we have a contract or not? Is there a law which binds us to do this? Do we have a valid purpose? If not, then can we mask this data from being processed? You know, let's have that culture being implemented in each and every department. It takes time, but then it has to be done. There's no way out. Then ongoing training and awareness program, and you'll have different set of programs for each role. It can't be the same. You'll have a different set of process level trainings for the frontline operators. You have a different set of training for people who are looking at the compliance related to privacy. You have a different set of trainings for people who are implementing the privacy program. Maybe you have a different awareness training for the top management. So and so on and so forth. And then underpinned by the training is the communication strategy, which we discussed. So there are clauses in 27701 which talk about what kind of internal and external communication to be given, who is accountable for that, at what frequency, what will be the agenda or content. Complete accountability has to be established proactively so that the privacy program can be successful. These are some salient operational management considerations. This is not an exhaustive list. There's much more to this, but I just wanted to present an abstract here. Then look at the governance. You don't want another governance mechanism. You want to integrate PIMS with your existing set of management reviews, your existing set of internal audits, your existing set of departmental reviews. So that is one of the considerations which you need to do. So your dashboards will be augmented with a lot of additional key performance indicators related to data protection, existing dashboards. Then what are the additional specific objectives and additions to the dashboard, which I just talked about? What is our second line of defense for minimizing exceptions? So our internal and external audit teams, what kind of value add can they give in terms of minimizing the exceptions, or maybe ensuring that the PIMS is fit for purpose and it is evolving with the changing context as well. So look at that also. Internal audit program has to be extended towards privacy as well. And then, as I mentioned, if some incidents happen, then the entire organization and its management is accountable. So it's not only the people who are maybe investigating the incidents. Apart from that, the management is also accountable for minimizing the impact of incidents. if you look at Article 83 of the EU GDPR, it clearly says that the amount of fine which is imposed on an organization is also dependent on whether previous such incidents have happened or not, and makes a material impact. Then we look at additional guidance for data controllers. So that's also there in ISO 27701. Some of the key aspects are the data controller is responsible for identifying legal basis or the lawful basis. Some examples of lawful basis could be either you have an explicit consent from the data subject, or you have a contract with the data subject, or maybe there's an underpinning law which binds you to collect that data, or maybe it is for the legitimate interest of the controller, or in the public interest. So these are some of the you can say legal basis. So controllers have to be mindful of these aspects before they start collecting or processing personal information. Controllers are obligated to do a privacy impact assessment. We talked about risk identification, risk treatment, etc. That comes under privacy impact assessment. Uh, so I think Article 35 of EU GDPR mandates that privacy impact assessment for controllers wherever they are dealing with sensitive personal information or large volumes of data, etc. Then privacy by design. So in the design stage itself, what are the controls which have been implemented for privacy? Are we minimizing the data right at the point of collection? Are we ensuring that data is collected with respect to the purpose for which it is intended, with no uh, and it's being used only for that purpose and no other purpose? How are we retaining the data? Are we monitoring the data inventories? Are we encrypting the data? How are we finally disposing it? What kind of disposal policies do we have? These are some of the aspects which are there in Annexure A of 27701, particularly for controllers. What kind of contracts are there with data processors? So uh, you may have looked at in GDPR also the binding contracts which are referred. So 27701 also talks about what are the contracts with data processors. Is the data processor very clear about their roles and responsibilities for processing personal information or not? Because if they are not doing, then the whole risk gets transferred to the data controller, back to the data controller, which we don't want. So in the contracts, are the roles and responsibilities defined with respect to privacy? What are the standard operating procedures defined? How will exceptions be managed and reported by the data processor? And what are the liabilities of the data processor? These are all enforced via contracts with data processors. Obligations to data subjects. As we know, there are rights which data subjects have. So how are those rights being acknowledged by the controller in terms of responsiveness, in terms of acknowledging, in terms of responding to the data subject on what data we are holding, for what purpose, what are the safeguards that we have? Are we transferring that data to third countries or not? Are we disclosing that to other countries? If yes, what kind of safeguards do we have? What kind of adequacy decisions do we have? All these are to be factored in by the data controllers. These are some examples uh, for Annexure A, which is meant specifically for data controllers. Let's look at additional guidance for data processors, which is part of Annexure B of ISO 27701. So it talks about that they have to be an agreement with the customer in which roles and responsibilities have to be clarified, um, how exceptions have to be managed has to be agreed, what kind of reports have to be generated, what kind of ongoing communication has to be there. Then restriction for marketing use, that's another accountability of the data processor. Data processor is also obligated to formulate controls right from the design stage. Uh, the moment they start collecting their data, right up to the point that they are disposing it. So what kind of privacy by design controls do the data processors have? And it's up to the data processors to uh, identify those controls with respect to the context. Then if, for example, data processor is obligated to respond uh, to customers or data subjects, then what will they do? How will they respond to the data controller? So data processor will liaise with data controller will then liaise with the data subject. That kind of a procedure has to be very, very clearly understood by the processor as well as the data controller. What kind of records to be maintained? For example, records of privacy impact assessment, records of incidents, records of due diligence done on business partners, records of training and awareness being given to the various staff. These are some examples of records which are to be maintained by the data processors. And then how are incidents to be reported within 72 hours, for example, or whatever time period? What are the remedial actions being taken? What is the impact to the data subjects? What all content to be reported via an incident management process? So these are some of the obligations of the data processor as per Annexure B of 27701. And at this point of time, I'm very keen to understand what's your view. Do you think 27701 provides some kind of a comprehensive and systematic approach towards privacy? So I'm requesting Prashant to open the poll, please, for half a minute. Thank you, Prashant.
Sure, Dheeraj. Now the poll is open.
Let's maybe give it 30 seconds. Thanks.
Sure. Ten seconds more. Okay, we have 78% respondent rate, out of which 97% has said yes and 3% has said no.
Okay. We appreciate that. So basically, we've just given an overview of 27701. For those who have said no, I would encourage them to have a better look at 27701. We've just given a high level overview. We haven't gone deeper. But then uh, I believe that 27701, I think, is a uh, very good management approach, holistic, repeatable, demonstrable towards a privacy program, and it can be readily customized also. See, it's a baseline. Any ISO standard is a baseline. It doesn't guarantee that there'll be no incidents, but it does give a systematic approach in terms of minimizing the risks, in terms of minimizing the impact of the risk. So with that, we're just going to summarize what we've talked about. We talked about organizations' responsibility and obligations to uphold to personal data protection, although the uh, landscape, the regulatory is complex, but it's evolving and we have to keep pace with it also. Uh, and then it's not just a reactive approach. It's in order to uphold our brand as a responsible service provider, we need to instill confidence in the customers that we are managing their personal information very, very carefully and exceeding their expectations. So it's a proactive aspect also. Then we talked about enhanced awareness of the data subjects and new or revised privacy regulations coming up. It's a matter of time before the Indian Personal Data Protection Bill is also passed as an act. It's there. It was tabled last year in December, I believe, in the Parliament. This year, obviously, the priorities were different due to the pandemic, but maybe next year, we think such a regulation will come and it will be applicable for all organizations across the board. And then hopefully over a matter of time, organizations will become more and more conscious towards upholding the rights of the data subjects. And then last but not the least, we talked about the details or the nuances of 27701 from a high level perspective. And we saw that it does give some kind of an integrated approach. It builds on top of ISMS. Many of the organizations already have an ISMS, so you don't need to have a separate management system. You can upgrade your ISMS to a privacy information management system, or PIMS, and you can use that across the supply chain for the simple reason that ISO is acknowledged worldwide wherever your supply chain is, maybe in India or somewhere else. Uh, just because it's ISO, it's neutral to any country, it's neutral to any law, it's acknowledged by most of the countries. That's how it has been published as an ISO standard. So I think with that, we are going to culminate this brief webinar. On behalf of BSI, my colleague Prashant and I, we thank you for your valuable time. If there are any queries, you're most welcome to put it in the chat box. And Prashant, I'll request you to moderate that, please. And later on, also, if you want to contact us, you're most welcome to do that. You can write to info.in@bsigroup.com. So over to the audience, Prashant, for any Q&A, please.
Request everyone to post their queries on the chat box so that we can take it one by one, or the question box. There are few queries which has been raised recently. So, or the question I should say, I am taking it one by one. Okay. If the organization is SOC 2 Type 2 of defense, plays a role in this? Three-line defense.
Yeah. So I think if you're collecting personal information even for your own employees, and you want to demonstrate how you want to do it responsibly, this standard or this set of best practices can definitely be imbibed with respect to the particular industry which you mentioned, defense industry, and you mentioned SOC 2, maybe you're processing data for US also. So definitely this standard can be applicable. And I would encourage you to have a look at this standard to answer that question in detail. But yes, it does. It is relevant. More questions, Prashant?
The other question, by implementing 27701 on top of 27K, can we say we are adhering to GDPR?
Yes. And the reason for that, yes, is when you look at 27701, there is something called as an annexure D, D for Delhi, annexure D, which gives you a one-to-one mapping between 27701 and GDPR. So I'm repeating, annexure D helps you do that very objectively. So the answer is yes, Prashant.
Okay. The other question Mr. Naik has asked, he wants to know, in case policies of EU GDPR are established, will it help in complying to 27701 requirements?
See, it's my perspective is like this, that EU GDPR is a regulation. It will not tell you, it will give you the end result that you need to have this in place. How to go about achieving that is primarily the objective of a management system standard like 27701, or for that matter, any other standard. So you can say compliance with EU GDPR or any other regulation like this is a end result, is a milestone. How to go about achieving or reaching that milestone is given by 27701. So I hope I've answered your question, please.
Okay. There is a question from Mr. Sunil. He wants to know, can an organization claim compliant to GDPR if it is certified for 27701?
That's a good question, very logical question. So it's like this, that complying to a law means demonstrating controls which are actually in line with the law. So if you have read article, I think 42 of EU GDPR, it talks about certain codes of practice. And in the long term, we expect 27701 to be one of these codes of practice, which will be recognized by these acts also, but it remains to be seen. So in Article 41 and 42 of EU GDPR, which is approved codes of conduct and certification, maybe in the long term, it is recognized by some of the supervisory authorities that if an organization is certified to 27701, then they are complying with EU GDPR as well. But it's up to the supervisory authorities to decide that, please. But it gives you a very good repeatable and demonstrable approach, at least, to showcase to any supervisory authority what are the controls that you have implemented as a responsible organization and how you are directly in line with the expectations of EU GDPR. So if the question comes up when you are conversing with a supervisory authority, the records which are being mandated by 27701 will definitely help you demonstrate. See, one is claiming that no, we are UGDPR compliant. I'm not saying you can claim, but you'll have you demonstrate appropriately. So there is a definite correlation towards being able to demonstrate compliance with that. But if you want to claim it, that claim has to be recognized by the supervisory authority, which is beyond our control. Hope I've answered that question, Prashant.
Yes, you did. Okay,
Okay.
if implement, there's another question from Mr. Vivek. He wants to know if we implement ISO 27701, are complying to CCPA and YFDA, GDPR, CII China?
That's a very good question. Although I'm not a legal expert, but I've gone through the salient aspects of CCPA, and I consider CCPA as a subset of EU GDPR, Prashant. So if I think the most holistic regulation which I've seen on privacy is EU GDPR. Others are in line with EU GDPR, like the CCPA. I don't know about China, so I don't want to claim that. Uh, but then CCPA is a subset of EU GDPR, and if one is compliant with EU GDPR, you are definitely working towards being compliant with CCPA as well. So that's the logical answer, but then it depends how well the organization can demonstrate what all controls has it got in place. Are those controls effective or not? Are they fit for purpose or not? And that is up to the organization to demonstrate, Prashant.
The other question is from Ms. Jemima. She wants to know that what's the average framework to get an organization ready for the ISO 27701 certification?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jamina. So you can first of all get hold of the standard from wherever you can download it from the ISO site or BSI, wherever you want to get it from. Then maybe you'll have to have some kind of a training and awareness program. You'll have to do some kind of a gap assessment on where you are with respect to this management standard, and then chalk out a program. Typically, Jamina, it'll take you 6 to 9 months for a typical organization. At least 6 months, I would say, maybe go up to 12 months also, depending on the size of the organization, depending on the complexity of the processes involved. Somewhere between 6 to 12 months. Through practical experience, I'm telling you, Jamina. Yes, Prashant.
Okay. The next question is from Mr. Bikash. He wants to know that can CISO in ISO 27K perform DPO role in 27701? I mean dual role.
Yes, definitely. The role can be extended to a CIO or a CISO also. So the answer is yes. It's up to the organization to decide. Nowadays, data protection officers are being outsourced also by organizations, Prashant. This is just as a perspective I'm giving. But the answer is yes.
Okay, the other question is from Mr. Ninath. He wants to know
Yeah.
any organizations certified to ISO 27701 by PSI till date?
Many organizations, Prashant, maybe they can write to info.in and we will definitely respond to them. So I've mentioned the email address here, info.in@bsigroup.com. We can give you the list also. We will have to check with those organizations, Prashant. But the answer is yes, many of them have been certified now. Only prerequisite is that the organization has to be certified to 27001 before they can go for certification to 27701.
Okay, there is a question from one of our delegate who wants to know, is there a designation for an officer to take in ISO 27701 role in a company?
So ISO or any ISO standard for that matter will not be so prescriptive in terms of mentioning designations or roles because this management standard has to be embraced by each and every organization across the globe. So as you know, it's a neutral standard. It does not prescribe any designation or role per se. It gives set of responsibilities, but it's up to the organization to decide what they want to call that role. Hope
Okay.
I've answered your question.
The other question from one of our delegate is there a separate PIMS, internal auditor and lead auditor course for ISO 27701, or this need
Yes.
to be performed by ISO 27K internal and lead auditor?
So there is a separate training which can be taken from BSI on auditing PMS. But before you take the auditing training, my request to all delegates is they should first go through an implementation training because the auditing training assumes that you know about 27701. Okay, so that's a prerequisite for auditor training. So we have implementation level programs, we have auditor level programs as well in BSI for trainings as well.
Okay. The other question is from Mr. Anil. He wants to know, is ISO 27701 is a certified standard or it needs to be implemented along with ISO 27701?
So as I mentioned, 27701, essentially the standard builds on top of 27001. So if an organization wants to get certified to 27701, it has to get certified on 27001 before that. It can't be a standalone certificate, Prashant, in terms of organization level certification.
Okay. The next question is from Irene. She wants to know, if I have undergone certified lead implementer professional course,
Yes,
including GDPR, training
yes.
still needs to be under implementer training.
So if she has undergone a CLIP program on 27701, then she need not go for another training. Then she's already done that. Uh, if that training, the CLIP training which she mentioned, did not have 27701, it was only 27001, then I think it makes logical sense for her to go through 27701 CLIP also. These are separate CLIP programs. So we have a CLIP for 27001 and we have a CLIP for 27701. The CLIP for 27701 assumes that you are aware of 27001 before coming for that program. Hope I've answered your question, please.
What she meant that she has gone through the CLIP program, which is for BS 1012
So
plus
that was a
GDPR.
separate
So
standard,
now,
Prashant. I understand. I understand the question. BS 10012, as you know, is a standalone standard, which is slightly different from 27701, Prashant. So,
okay,
so the simple answer is, it will be better if she can go through requirements of 27701 in terms of implementation.
okay. There's other question from Irene itself, where she wants to know, is registering to supervisory authority mandatory?
So it depends on the applicable law. So, for example, if you are present in India itself and not anywhere else, then the answer is no. If you are present in Europe or you are working for European clients, then you have to have a point of presence in Europe as well and maybe register with the local supervisory authority there in Europe. It depends on the context, Prashant.
Okay. Can we take a last question, Dheeraj, because we are already 10
Yeah.
minutes past 4, right?
Yes.
Maybe there's a huge list of questions which
which I
our
appreciate
delegates
actually.
want to know. And is it possible if you can revert back to them and
Yeah, yeah, we
solve their
can revert.
queries?
Let them write to info.in@bsigroup.com. We'll revert to them latest
And
by
I will
next.
also share the list of questions what they have asked over here with the
Yes.
concerned person name so that you would be able to answer them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Will that be okay?
So yeah, that will be okay. Maybe we can have one more question, Prashant, and then end the webinar.
Yes. The other question is from Mr. Mahesh. He wants to know is an integrated audit for ISMS and PIMS possible?
Definitely, yes. The organization should strive for integrated audits rather than, and which makes it more efficient for an organization.
Okay, thank you, Dheeraj. I think there are a lot of questions which people have asked, but we were not able to cover everything. But certainly, Dheeraj is going to revert to every questions. So, in case if you want to ask any further questions, please feel free to mail us at info.in@bsigroup.com. We'll certainly take it up and try to resolve your queries as soon as possible. Thank you, everyone, once again for joining this wonderful session taken by Dheeraj. Dheeraj, would you like to have a last word before
I,
we?
I, I really want to thank the participants for being so interactive and asking so many questions. We'll ensure that we answer their questions. Let them email it to us. We've exceeded by 10 minutes. So I really thank them for their time and their enthusiasm and look forward to meeting you again. Thank you so much. Have a nice weekend. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone, for once again, and wish you will be having a great weekend ahead. And happy Diwali also.